Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the really fascinating origins and evolution of the Dalai Lama. It's a title, everyone recognizes it globally, but its roots go way, way back, centuries deep in Tibetan Buddhism and, well, Central Asian history, too.
They really do. And the material we looked at, primarily the Wikipedia page on the Dalai Lama, it gives a surprisingly comprehensive overview, actually.
Right.
It touches on the history, the names, the titles, so many titles, the residences, and, the complexities around how the next Dalai Lama is found. It's this incredible mix of religion and, well, politics.
Absolutely, a real tapestry. And that's our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To really unpack the key bits, like the spiritual foundation, how the whole lineage thing even started, which is kind of surprising. The historical back and forth with powers like the Mongols and Chinese and, where things are now. What's the future look like?
We're looking for those aha moments.
Exactly, those moments that just make it click. So maybe start with the name, Dalai Lama. Seems simple, but there's a lot packed in there.
It really is. The full title, get this, Holiness, Knowing Everything, Vajrayana Dalai Lama.
Wow.
Yeah, that tells you something, right? It was given back in 1578 by Altan Khan, a big Mongol leader, to Sonam Gyatso, who we now call the third Dalai Lama.
Okay.
And breaking down Dalai Lama itself, Dalai is Mongolian for ocean.
Ocean, like vastness.
Exactly, vastness, depth. And Lama is Tibetan for master or guru. So ocean master, essentially.
Ocean of wisdom, maybe.
That's the idea. The source notes Dalai is basically the same as the Tibetan word Gyatso, also meaning ocean. And there's even a suggestion it might echo a Mongolian royal title, Dalayan Kwan, adding this layer of, immense authority.
Interesting. So it's not just spiritual depth, but maybe a hint of worldly power, too.
Could be. And Tibetans themselves often use other names like Ridyalba Rinpoche, meaning precious conqueror, or just Rejalba.
So multiple layers of meaning and respect built right into how he's addressed.
Right. And then you have the Chinese rulers adding their own titles over the centuries.
Oh, yeah, the source mentioned those.
Yeah, the Ming Dynasty had things like Dugara Zeng Chang and universally holding Vajra Buddha.
Okay.
Then the Qing Dynasty got even more elaborate. Titles like, wait for it, Freedom Buddha of the Great Goodness of the Western Paradise, leading the world of Buddhism, knowing everything, Vajrahara Dalai Lama.
Slight chuckle. That's quite a mouthful.
Isn't it? And they even tweaked it later. It really shows this historical dynamic, China trying to sort of frame the Dalai Lama's role within their own system.
Which brings us neatly to the spiritual side of things. This wasn't just a political title cooked up, right?
Right.
There's a deep spiritual belief behind it.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The core belief, going back to at least the 11th century in Central Asian Buddhism, is that the Dalai Lamas are manifestations, actual physical embodiments of Avalokiteshvara.
Bodhisattva of compassion.
Exactly, the Bodhisattva of compassion, and he's considered the patron saint of Tibet. That belief is the bedrock. Everything else rests on that.
It's powerful how that idea of compassion still resonates so much today with the current Dalai Lama's global image.
It really does. And some traditions trace the lineage back even further. The 14th Dalai Lama's own website apparently suggests a link way back to a Brahmin boy in the time of the Buddha Shakyamuni.
Wow, that's ancient.
It emphasizes this profound spiritual authority. There's even this idea mentioned in connection with the 14th Dalai Lama of Avalokiteshvara having this long-term kind of master plan.
A master plan.
Yeah, to gradually establish the Dalai Lama institution in Tibet, specifically to guide and protect the Tibetan people over centuries.
Like a divine strategy unfolding over time. That's quite a concept. So how did this plan, actually become reality? How did the lineage get formally established?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The person we now call the first Dalai Lama, Gendon Drop, he lived around 1391 to 1474, a major disciple of Jet Tsongkhapa, who founded the Gelug school.
Okay, the Gelug, so that's the dominant school, right?
Right. But here's the twist. Gendon Drop was only recognized as the first Dalai Lama after he died.
Posthumously.
Yeah. And even more surprising, the Gelug school itself, initially, was apparently kind of resistant to the whole Tulku system, the idea of recognizing reincarnations for succession.
Wait, so the school the Dalai Lamas belonged to was initially skeptical of the very system that defines them?
Sort of, yeah. Their early focus was more on monastic discipline, study, earning your position, not inherited through reincarnation.
That is unexpected. So how did it shift?
Well, after Gendon Drop died, this boy, Gendon Gyatso, born in 1475, apparently started claiming from a very young age, like 3 years old, hey, I'm Gendon Drup.
At 3, okay.
Yeah. And eventually, probably as the Tolka system became more widely accepted in Tibet generally, the Gelug leaders were convinced. They recognized him as the reincarnation. But the title Dalai Lama itself didn't come until the third one, Sonam Gyatso.
Ah, the one who met Ultan Khan.
Exactly. He was the first one actually called Dalai Lama during his life, thanks to Ultan Khan in 1578. And then they went back and said, okay, Gendon Drup was the first, Gendon Gyatso the second.
So they applied the title backwards, retroactively.
Pretty much, yeah. Solidified the lineage that way.
And that connection with Ultan Khan, the Mongol leader, seems critical. It really highlights how intertwined Tibetan Buddhism was with politics in the region.
Absolutely. Which leads us straight into the political roles. It wasn't always just spiritual leadership, was it?
Seems not.
No, definitely not. The big turning point was the fifth Dalai Lama, and Gawang Lobsang Gyatso, often called the Great Fifth. He lived 1617 to 1682.
The Great Fifth, okay.
With significant help from Mongol military power, he managed to unify Tibet and basically became both the top religious and political ruler from 1642 onwards. That setup lasted right up until 1959.
Wow, over 300 years of dual rule.
Yeah, he established the Ganden Phodrang government based in Lhasa. He was the head honcho, spiritually and politically.
And the source mentions this Mkad-Yan relationship, priest and patron. What's that about?
Right, Mijijan. It describes this historical pattern, this kind of alliance between Tibetan Buddhist leaders, like the Dalai Lamas, and powerful secular rulers, Mongols, Manchus, later Chinese officials.
So, like a deal.
Sort of. The idea is the patron, the secular ruler, gives political protection, maybe military support, money, resources.
Okay.
And in return, the priest, the religious leader, provides spiritual guidance, blessings, maybe performs rituals, basically conferring legitimacy on the ruler.
So mutual support. Some argue it helped Tibet stay somewhat autonomous, right?
That's one view, yeah. That it was a way for Tibet to navigate relationships with powerful neighbors and maintain some internal control.
There's always a but with power dynamics, isn't there?
Chuckles, usually yes. The other perspective, highlighted by some historians, is that this Shangjian often papered over the fact that the patron was usually much more powerful.
So it could mask dominance.
Exactly. You look at the Yuan or Qing dynasties, for example. They might respect Tibetan religion, sure, but they'd still consider Tibet part of their empire, or at least under their authority. So was it a partnership of equals? Or did it effectively make Tibet a protectorate or vassal state at times? That's the debate.
Yeah, you can see how that interpretation could shift depending on who you ask and when. Which brings us to the relationship with China specifically. That's obviously complex and long-running.
Extremely complex. Under the Qing dynasty, Tibet was largely seen, at least by the king, as a protectorate. Then, after the king fell in 1912, the 13th Dalai Lama declared independence in 1913.
But that wasn't really recognized internationally.
Not widely, no. Though Nepal apparently did recognize it initially. Fast forward to 1951, the People's Republic of China is in power, and the 17-point agreement is signed.
Which the 14th Dalai Lama ratified.
Initially, yes. It affirmed Chinese sovereignty but promised Tibet autonomy. But then came the 1959 uprising. The Dalai Lama fled to India, and he revoked the agreement.
And his stance shifted over time, from independence to
autonomy. For decades now, especially since around 2005, he's publicly said he's not seeking separation, but genuine autonomy for Tibet within the PRC.
A significant evolution in his position.
Yeah.
And the whole issue of who gets to choose the next Dalai Lama, that's a major point of contention, isn't it?
Oh, huge. The Chinese government insists it has the right to oversee and approve the selection, pointing to historical precedent, like that golden urn system from the 18th century.
Right, the golden urn.
But the current Dalai Lama strongly disagrees. He says it's purely a religious matter for Tibetan Buddhists alone, and has stated very clearly that he opposes any political interference, especially from China, in finding his reincarnation.
A fundamental disagreement right there. It really highlights how individual Dalai Lamas have navigated these massive historical and political waves. Any other key figures we should touch on?
Definitely. We mentioned the third, Sonam Gyatso converting Ultan Khan. That was huge for bringing Mongolia into the Gelug sphere.
And the fourth was actually Mongolian himself.
Yes, Gendon Gyatso. Cemented those ties, though reportedly not everyone in Tibet was thrilled about having a Mongol Dalai Lama at the time.
Understandable friction, perhaps. And we covered the Great Fifth, unifying Tibet, starting the Potala.
Right. And his visit to Beijing is interesting, too. He got a golden seal from the King Emperor. China saw it one-way submission, maybe, Tibetan accounts suggest the Dalai Lama saw its meaning differently. Shows the competing narrative.
Always competing narratives. The sixth sounds like a real character.
Sangyan Gyatso.
Gah.
Yeah, very controversial. Apparently renounced his monastic vows, wrote love poetry, lived a more secular life. It didn't end well. He was deposed and died en route to Beijing. Really shows the pressures involved.
A tragic story. And the seventh?
Khalzan Gyatso. He came in after a Dzungar Mongol invasion,
Yeah.
actually with king help, so king influence definitely increased then. But he also managed to reestablish the Tibetan government under the Dalai Lama in 1751 and started building the Norbulinka, the summer palace.
Okay, so periods of influence ebb and flow. Then the eighth was less political, and then this strange period with the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th all dying young.
Yes, a period of instability, ruled by regents. The sources mention lots of theories about their short lives, illness, maybe inadequate care, but also darker theories about political intrigue, even poisoning. Some even connect it to visits to that sacred lake, Lamo Lotso.
The lake where they look for visions.
That's the one. Though the current Dalai Lama, in his own writings, seems to lean towards lack of proper medical knowledge or maybe negligence, rather than foul play being the main reason.
Interesting. And that brings us to the modern era, the 13th and 14th, dealing with the massive shifts of the 20th century.
Exactly. The 13th, Thubten Gyatso, took power back from the regents, made that 1913 Declaration of Independence, tried to modernize Tibet a bit.
And the 14th, Tenzin Gyatso, the current Dalai Lama. His life has been defined by the flight into exile in 59.
Right. Establishing the government in exile, becoming this global figure, advocating for Tibet, initially independence, now that middle way approach, seeking autonomy. And his thoughts on his own succession are obviously key right now.
Absolutely. Before we get to succession, quickly on residences. Potala and Norbulinka are the famous ones in Lhasa. Where were the earlier ones based?
Good question. Before the fifth really consolidated things in Lhasa, earlier Dalai Lamas were often based at major monasteries like Tashi Lhunpo or Drepung.
Okay.
But yeah, the fifth started the Potala as the winter palace, Norbulinka as the summer one. Those became the iconic seats of power. And now, of course, the 14th resides in McLeod Ganj, Dharamshala in India.
Right, in exile. Okay, so the search for the reincarnation. How does that actually work? It sounds mystical.
It's a blend of things.
Yeah.
Deeply spiritual, yes. They might consult the Nechung oracle, that's the state oracle, believed to channel a deity.
An oracle. Okay.
High Lamas might meditate by that sacred lake, Lama Lotsa, hoping for visions, maybe seeing letters or landscapes giving clues to where the child might be.
Visions in a lake.
Sometimes even the direction smoke drifts after the cremation of the previous Dalai Lama is seen as significant. And then there's that historical golden urn method from the King era.
Which is controversial now.
Very. Especially given how it was reportedly used in the selection of the Panchen Lama recently. The current Dalai Lama has basically rejected its validity for finding his successor.
And he's been quite open about the future, hasn't he? Saying the lineage might even end.
He has. He's mentioned the possibility of not reincarnating at all, or letting the Tibetan people decide via referendum if they even want another Dalai Lama. He's also been very clear. His reincarnation will not be born in a territory controlled by the People's Republic of China.
So laying down some clear conditions and possibilities there, it's just so apparent, isn't it? The Dalai Lama isn't just one thing. It's this deep, centuries-long story of faith, politics, culture.
Absolutely. It embodies Tibetan history, spiritual belief, and these incredibly complicated relationships with neighbors, from relatively obscure beginnings to global recognition.
It's a story of resilience, really.
It is. And all the questions swirling around the 14th Dalai Lama's succession just prove how relevant this institution still is, even now in the 21st century.
So thinking about that future, the 14th Dalai Lama himself seems open to radical change. A woman, maybe no successor at all. What do you think happens next? How does tradition balance with, well, geopolitics and individual choice?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's this fascinating intersection of ancient tradition, the current Dalai Lama's very forward-thinking views, and the undeniable political realities, particularly with China. How that plays out, well, nobody knows for sure.
It really leaves you thinking. This deep dive has covered so much ground, but like you said, it feels like we've only scratched the surface of this incredibly rich history. Thank you for guiding us through it.
My pleasure. It's an endlessly fascinating topic. You know that feeling. You're just constantly bombarded with the latest fitness craze.
Oh, absolutely. One week it's one thing, the next it's something totally different.
Exactly. And sometimes you just crave something solid, something with a real foundation. Yeah. Effective without all the hype.
Well, that's a perfect lead-in to our topic today.
Pilates. We are doing a deep dive.
And it's interesting because while Pilates definitely has its trendy moments, its history goes way back, like over a century.
Yeah, the sources we looked at give this really comprehensive picture from the very beginning right up to now.
From its origins, the core ideas, the different types, Matt, reformer even, how it stacks up against yoga.
Precisely. And we've sifted through its history, the principles, the science bit, the legal side too. Our goal here is to pull out the most important stuff, the really surprising bits, and give you a proper understanding.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Joseph Pilates. Who was he?
So he was a German physical trainer born late 1800s. And here's a fun fact. He didn't call it Pilates originally.
Ah, right. It was contrology, wasn't it?
That's the one. Contrology. Now it's everywhere, of course. Big in Australia, Canada, the UK.
And the origin story itself is, well, pretty incredible. It came out of a really tough time for him.
It really did. World War I, he was interned. Knockalow camp on the Isle of Man.
Right.
And instead of just enduring it, he started developing his exercise system right there, working with fellow internees.
Wow.
He had this deep belief in the connection, the link between mental and physical health.
And if you think about the time period, late 19th, early 20th century, there was this whole physical culture movement happening.
Yeah, exercise is medicine almost.
Sort of, yeah. Preventing illness, helping recovery, plus those older traditions of corrective exercise like medical gymnastics, per Henrik Ling, people like that. It was kind of in the air.
That context makes sense. And Pilates didn't just stick to exercises. He invented equipment, his apparatus.
The famous reformer. Still the most popular piece, probably.
He called it the universal reformer originally, which says a lot about his vision for it, doesn't it?
Definitely. And there were others too, the Cadillac, the Wenda chair, the spine corrector.
Each designed for specific kinds of assistance or challenge. Really quite ingenious.
He wrote about it too. 2 key books.
Your Health in 1934, and then Return to Life through Contrology in 45. Laying it all out.
And interestingly, the lineage is quite direct. He personally certified only 2 instructors.
Just 2. Who were they?
Kathy Stanford Grant and Lolita San Miguel.
Wow. Okay, so that's the backstory, but let's get into the method itself. What is Pilates, fundamentally?
Well, there was a systematic review back in 2012 that summed it up quite nicely.
Oh yeah, what did it say?
It called Pilates a mind-body exercise that requires core stability, strength, and flexibility, and attention to muscle control, posture, and breathing.
Okay, so mind and body, not just physical reps.
And it's adaptable, yeah.
Totally. One source really emphasized that it can be tailored to a spectrum of fitness goals, ages, and abilities.
But it's primarily strength and flexibility, not cardio.
Exactly. That's a key distinction.
Yeah.
It's not designed to be an aerobic workout. Got it. And what about the core principles? Are there specific rules?
Yeah, there are guiding principles. One framework mentions 5 essentials.
5 essentials.
Breath, cervical alignment, that's your neck, posture rib, and scapular stabilization, so keeping your shoulder blades stable, pelvic mobility, and using that deep core muscle, the transversus abdominis.
That's quite detailed.
It is. And typically, you don't do tons of reps, usually just 3 to 5 per exercise, but with intense focus.
The breath seems huge.
Yeah.
Joseph Pilates himself said, above all, learn how to breathe correctly.
Absolutely central. It's all about the art of controlled movements. Pilates wrote, it should feel like a workout, even if it has therapeutic effects.
Right, not physical therapy, but a workout.
Yeah, and consistent practice. It aims to boost flexibility, build strength, develop control, endurance, focusing on alignment, that breath, the core, the powerhouse, as he called it.
The powerhouse, I've heard that term.
Right, the deep abdominals, back muscles, pelvic floor, all working together, plus coordination and balance.
And it's not one size fits all. You can modify things.
Definitely. Exercises can be tweaked for beginners or made harder as you get stronger. And, different schools of Pilates have popped up, sometimes adding a few more principles, maybe up to 9.
Okay. And if you want someone really qualified?
Look for comprehensive Pilates teachers. That usually means they've trained extensively on both the mat and all the different apparatus.
All right. Now, the big question, does it work? What's the science say?
Okay. This is where things get interesting. Or maybe complex.
How so?
Well, a major review, a meta-study by the Australian government in 2015, looked at Pilates along with other alternative therapies.
Yeah.
Their conclusion was that the evidence for its effectiveness was limited and uncertain, mostly because of the quality and type of studies available.
Limited and uncertain. That's quite a statement. Did it have consequences?
It did, yeah. In Australia, they removed Pilates from health insurance subsidies in 2017 based on that review.
Wow. Okay. Did the review look at specific conditions like back pain?
Yes. For lower back pain, it found low-quality evidence suggesting Pilates was better than doing nothing,
Okay. Better than nothing.
but not necessarily more effective than other kinds of exercise.
So on par with other exercises, potentially.
That's what the evidence suggested at the time. However, they did find some evidence that regular Pilates could improve abdominal muscle conditioning in healthy people compared to doing no exercise.
So good for the abs, maybe.
Potentially, yeah, for healthy adults.
What about balance? People often say it helps with balance, especially older adults.
The review didn't find good evidence for that, specifically in older adults,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not the whole story.
Oh,
Another source we looked at mentioned that some limited data does suggest Pilates has been effective for rehabbing various conditions.
so maybe more useful in specific therapeutic cases.
It could be. The challenge really is studying something like Pilates effectively. It's so individualized, you know. Standardizing it for a big study is tricky. It doesn't easily fit the mold of, say, a drug trial.
That makes sense. It highlights the need for maybe different kinds of research or just more robust studies. Okay, let's switch gears slightly. Mat versus reformer. What's the difference in practice?
So you can do Pilates just on a mat using your body weight or on the specialized equipment.
Like the reformer we mentioned.
Exactly. The reformer is that machine with the sliding platform, springs for resistance, straps, pulleys. It gives support, especially for the spine, but also adds resistance to challenge muscles in unique ways.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Like working your upper back, you might lie face down on a padded box on the carriage and pull straps attached to the springs. The springs provide the resistance.
Okay, so the machine adds resistance and support. What about mat work?
Mat Pilates is really about using your own body weight and gravity as the resistance. Think of the roll-up.
The roll-up.
Yeah, where you lie on your back and slowly roll up to a seated position using your core muscles, then control it back down. It's all body weight.
But you can use props in both, can't you? Like resistance bands or those rings?
Oh yeah, definitely. Magic circles, bands, small balls. They can add challenge or assistance in both mat and reformer classes.
Okay. Now the inevitable comparison. Pilates versus yoga. People often lump them together.
They do, and there are similarities. Both are mind-body practices, both involve stretching, both use breath.
Right, but they're not the same.
Not at all. Yoga often involves holding static poses, maybe flowing between them. Pilates is generally more focused on moving your limbs while keeping your core stable.
And the spiritual aspect?
Yeah.
Yoga sometimes has that.
Yeah, modern yoga can have explicit spiritual components, which isn't typically a focus in Pilates. Pilates is more purely about the physical mechanics and control.
What about the breath? We know it's key in Pilates.
Yeah.
How does it differ from yoga breathing?
In yoga, the breath is often used for relaxation, deepening stretches, maybe holding poses. In Pilates, breath is more active. It's used to power the movement, to engage the muscles more effectively.
Interesting. Powering the movement.
Yeah, and starting positions often differ too. Lots of Pilates starts lying down, while yoga often starts standing.
But some poses look similar, don't they?
Oh, for sure. There's overlap. Pilates has an open leg balance that looks a lot like yoga's boat pose or navasana.
Uh-huh.
The rollover in Pilates is like plow pose, halasana. The Pilates swan resembles yoga's cobra, bhujangasana.
Okay.
And the Pilates push-up is similar to yoga's low plank, chaturanga dandasana. Both build strength, flexibility, fitness.
But the emphasis is different.
Generally, yes. Pilates puts a really strong emphasis on core strength, that powerhouse idea. Yoga often prioritizes flexibility, though strength is obviously involved too.
Got it. Okay, one last area, the legal side. Is Pilates like a protected term? Is it regulated?
Surprisingly, no, it's not professionally regulated like some other fields might be.
Really? So anyone can say they teach Pilates?
Pretty much. And there's a fascinating legal story there. Back in October 2000, a U.S. federal court ruled that Pilates is actually a generic term.
Generic, like Kleenex or aspirin.
Kind of, yeah, meaning anyone could use the name. No license needed.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah.
But we still capitalize it, right?
Yeah.
Pilates.
We do, but that's just because it comes from Joseph Pilates' proper name.
So what happened after that ruling? Did people try to organize?
Yes,
No.
exactly. The Pilates Method Alliance, the PMA, was formed. It's a professional association aiming to, preserve the original teachings, set some standards for instructors, promote professionalism.
Ah, okay. So there's an effort to maintain quality, even if the name itself isn't legally restricted.
Right. It's more about community standards and upholding the legacy.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground here. Let's try and pull it all together.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey.
We started with Joseph Pilates, Contrology, that incredible origin story in the internment camp.
Then the core principles, mind-body connection, the powerhouse, breath control.
Differentiating mat and reformer work, the equipment.
Comparing it to yoga, the similarities, but those key differences in focus and movement.
And that whole surprising legal history, the term becoming generic.
Yeah. It leaves you with this picture of a method with a really rich personal history, a dedicated following.
But, as we discussed, the broad scientific backing is still kind of evolving, or at least complex.
Exactly. Which brings up a really interesting point for you, the listener, to think about.
What's that?
Well, what does it mean when you have a practice like this? One with such a strong anecdotal reputation, such history, such devoted practitioners, but where the large-scale scientific proof of widespread effectiveness isn't perhaps as clear-cut as for some other things. Does that change how you view it? Do the core ideas, the controlled movement, the focus on core engagement, that mind-body link, do those resonate with your own goals, your own curiosity about movement and well-being, regardless of what the current meta-studies show?
It's definitely something to chew on as you figure out your own approach to fitness and feeling good in your body.
Absolutely. A fascinating intersection of history, practice, and science. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're heading straight into a massive force of nature from our own sun.
That's right. We're talking coronal mass ejections.
CMEs. These things that are always happening, but sometimes they send ripples our way.
Yeah, think of it as the sun, really flexing its magnetic muscles.
Okay. So we've gathered a lot of info to really get into what these solar events are all about.
How they start, what they're made of, and crucially, what they can do when they head towards Earth.
Right. So CMEs, in a nutshell.
They're basically these enormous releases of plasma and magnetic field from the sun's outer atmosphere, the corona.
And they often show up with solar flares, those big, bright flashes.
They do, yeah. Though the exact connection, well, it's still a bit fuzzy, scientifically speaking.
Oh, when they escape the sun and travel through space?
Then we call them ICMEs, interplanetary coronal mass ejections.
ICMEs. Got it. And that's when they become relevant to us, right?
Exactly. Because they can travel all the way here and collide with Earth's magnetosphere.
Our planet's sort of protective magnetic bubble.
Precisely. And that collision, that's where things get interesting.
Electrifying, you might say.
Quite literally sometimes. It can trigger geomagnetic storms.
Ah, okay, so that's the aurora, the northern and southern lights.
That's the most visible and beautiful effect, yes. But these storms, they can also interfere with our technology.
How so?
Well, in rarer cases, they can actually cause damage to things like electrical power grids.
Wow. That sounds serious.
It can be. To grasp the power, think about the solar storm of 1859, the Carrington event.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that one. Biggest ever recorded.
That's the one. It wreaked havoc on the telegraph systems back then. Sparks flying, operators getting shocks.
Hard to imagine from something happening 93 million miles away.
It really highlights our vulnerability, even today, with, much more advanced systems.
And these aren't super rare events, are they? You said they happen often.
Oh, yeah. Near the sun's peak activity, the solar maximum, we can see maybe 3 CMEs a day, on average.
3 a day.
And even during the quiet times, the solar minimum, it's still about 1 every 5 days or so.
So the sun's always active in this way. It's just a matter of whether one's pointed at us.
Exactly. So our mission today, in this deep dive, is to really unpack these things.
Understand the physics, follow their journey, look at the impacts past and future.
Let's do it.
Okay, fundamentals first. What is a CME actually made of?
Well, at its heart, it's a huge cloud of plasma.
Plasma. So superheated gas Electrons and protons.
Exactly, all tangled up with a magnetic field. And that field often has this kind of twisted helical shape, like a coil.
A flux rope, is that the term?
That's the one, a magnetic flux rope.
And we're talking about a lot of material, right? This isn't just a puff of smoke.
Oh, absolutely not. The average mass thrown out is, let me check the figure, 1.6 times 10 to the 12 kilograms.
That's a lot of zeros.
Yeah.
1.6 trillion kilograms.
Pretty much like launching a mountain range into space.
Yeah.
Remember, that's probably a low estimate.
Why is that?
Because our measurements are mostly 2D. We're looking at a 3D structure edge-on, effectively.
Right, okay. So where do they actually erupt from on the sun? What's the starting point?
They come from the lower corona, specifically from areas where the magnetic fields are really strongly twisted or sheared, stressed out, basically.
Like a rubber band wound too tight.
Good analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. These structures are held down by overlying magnetic fields, but it's a very tense balance.
And where do these powerful magnetic fields come from in the first place?
They're generated deeper inside the sun. There's a process called the solar dynamo.
The dynamo.
Yeah, it generates the fields, which then rise up and pop through the surface, the photosphere. That's where we see active regions, sunspots, things like that.
Okay. And these active regions often have like a north and south magnetic pole.
Yeah, typically a dipole structure, like a bar magnet, basically.
I've read about polarity inversion lines, or PILs. What are they?
Ah, PILs. Good point. They're basically the boundaries on the sun's surface, where the magnetic field direction flips from, say, pointing outwards to pointing inwards.
Like a magnetic equator, almost.
Sort of, yeah. And these lines, these PILs, are really key locations. That's where the magnetic structures that are going to erupt often form and sit before they go.
So it all comes down to storing up magnetic energy.
Exactly. You need a lot of stored magnetic energy. We call it magnetic free energy. It builds up as new magnetic fields emerge, or as the surface motions twist and shear the existing field lines.
Like winding that spring tighter and tighter?
Precisely.
Are there visual clues, things we can see that suggest a CME might be building up?
Sometimes, yes. We can see structures called sigmoids. They look like S-shapes or reverse S-shapes in UV or X-ray images.
And that shape tells us there's a lot of twist or shear.
That's the idea, yes. It indicates a highly stressed magnetic configuration.
You mentioned flux ropes being in the CME, but do they exist before it erupts, or do they form during the eruption?
That's a really key question. And honestly, there's still debate about it. Yeah. We know flux ropes are fundamental after the eruption. But do they pre-exist, just waiting to launch? Or do they form dynamically during the event itself?
How would they form during the event?
Through processes like tether cutting or flux cancellation. Imagine magnetic field lines reconnecting in a way that snips the tethers, holding things down, allowing a new rope structure to form and rise.
Okay. Or there's another model.
There's also the magnetic breakout model, which involves a more complex, sort of multi-layered magnetic setup. Reconnection higher up allows the lower structure to break out.
Fascinating. And what about prominences or filaments, those big loops of gas we see?
Right, prominences. They're often involved. They're actually cooler, denser materials suspended in the hot corona, held up by these magnetic structures.
So they're part of the pre-eruption setup?
Often, yes. They sit in what are called filament channels or prominence cavities. And frequently, the bright core you see in a CME image, that's the erupting prominence material.
Okay, so we have this stressed, energy-loaded magnetic structure, maybe with a prominence inside. What's the actual trigger? What makes it finally let go?
It happens when that structure, which was in a sort of fragile balance, becomes unstable. It crosses a threshold.
The spring snaps.
Exactly. But how it snaps? Well, that's another area where the details are still being worked out. It might not be the same trigger for every single CME.
What are the main theories?
Well, you could have instabilities predicted by ideal MHD, that's magnetohydrodynamics.
Yeah.
Things like the kink instability, if a flux rope gets twisted too much.
Kink instability.
No. Or the torus instability, which is more about the balance with the overlying field weakening rapidly as the structure rises. Or just a general catastrophic loss of equilibrium.
And then there were those other mechanisms, non-ideal MHD.
Right. Things like the tether cutting or flux cancellation we mentioned, where magnetic reconnection plays a direct role in changing the structure and letting it escape. Or that magnetic breakout model again.
So multiple ways it could start. Once it is unleashed, what gives it that incredible outward speed?
Ah, the acceleration phase. It's a battle, really. You've got magnetic tension from the stretched field lines pulling down, plus the sun's gravity.
Trying to hold it back.
Exactly. But working against that, propelling it outwards is likely magnetic reconnection happening below the rising core.
Reconnection again. How does that push it?
Well, as the structure rises, the field lines underneath get squeezed together, forming a current sheet. Reconnection there releases a huge amount of energy.
Okay.
And it does two things. One, it cuts those anchoring field lines, reducing the downward pull. Two, the outflow from the reconnection of hot plasma and energy gives the whole structure a powerful upward kick.
Like a rocket engine igniting underneath it.
That's a great way to think about it, yeah. And it can become self-sustaining for a while. More lift, more reconnection, more acceleration.
But sometimes they don't quite make it out.
That happens too. If the acceleration isn't strong enough to overcome the downward forces, the eruption might stall and fall back. We call those failed or confined eruptions.
Are there other signs on the sun when a CME is just starting? Other fireworks?
Oh, definitely. You often see the erupting prominence itself, if there was one. That's often the bright core.
Right.
And very frequently you see solar flares, especially two-ribbon flares. They're thought to be caused by the energy from that reconnection region slamming back down into the lower atmosphere.
So the flare is almost a side effect of the CME launch mechanism.
In many cases, yes, that seems to be the relationship.
What about those big waves we sometimes see spreading across the sun in UV images?
The EUV waves, or sometimes called EIT waves, or Morton waves lower down. Those are believed to be fast-mode MHD waves, like a shock front, propagating out from the eruption site, pushing through the corona.
Like a blast wave.
Yes.
Yeah.
And another sign is coronal dimming.
Dim.
Yeah, you see a localized area become darker in EUV or soft X-rays for a while. It's thought to be because the CME has literally evacuated the plasma from that region as it expanded outwards.
Okay, so the CME blasts off, it's accelerating, maybe causing flares and waves. How do we actually track it once it leaves the immediate vicinity of the sun?
Our main tool there is the white light coronagraph.
Coronagraph.
Yeah.
That blocks out the sun's disk.
Exactly. It creates an artificial eclipse so we can see the much, much fainter structures in the corona and beyond.
And how does it see the CME?
The CME itself is plasma electrons mainly. Sunlight scatters off these free electrons, a process called Thomson scattering. The coronagraph picks up this scattered light.
Clever. What does a typical CME look like in those images?
The classic picture is often described as having three parts. There's a bright core.
The prominence material.
Likely, yes. Then there's a darker area around it, the cavity, and then a bright leading edge, which is probably plasma being compressed as the CME plows outwards.
But they don't all look like that.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
They could be much messier, more complex shapes. That three-part structure is sort of the textbook ideal.
And the speeds, you mentioned they vary hugely.
They really do. From maybe 20 kilometers a second, which is quite slow, relatively speaking, up to over 3,000 kilometers per second. That's incredibly fast.
Wow. What's typical?
The average speed is somewhere around 490 kilometers per second. But interestingly, they don't just keep that initial speed.
Oh, they speed up or slow down.
Yeah, they tend to adjust towards the speed of the surrounding solar wind, like they feel a drag force.
Okay. And once they get far enough out, that's when we switch terms from CME to ICME.
That's right. Usually the cutoff is considered around 50 solar radii out, which is about, 0.23 AU, a fair way towards Earth's orbit.
So now we have an ICME cruising through interplanetary space. It's not empty out there, though, is it?
Not at all. It's filled with the solar wind, that constant stream of particles from the sun and the interplanetary magnetic field. The ICME has to navigate all that.
And interact with it.
Constantly. The main interaction is with the solar wind itself, that aerodynamic drag we mentioned. It tries to pull the ICME speed towards the background wind speed.
So fast ones slow down, slow ones speed up.
Generally, yes.
How well do we actually model that journey? It sounds complicated.
It is complicated, and yeah, our understanding is still evolving. We have models, like the drag model or the snowplow model, which try to predict how they evolve.
Snowplow.
Yeah, like it's sweeping up the material ahead of it. These models work reasonably well for some events, but not perfectly for all of them. It's an active research area.
Okay. Now, if an ICME is moving much faster than the solar wind, say, over 500 kilometers.
Right. Then it can drive a shock wave ahead of itself.
Like a sonic boom from a jet.
Exactly the same principle. But it's a magnetosonic shock in plasma. It happens when the ICME outruns the speed at which magnetic signals travel through the surrounding solar wind.
And we can see these shocks.
We can sometimes see them forming near the sun. They're also linked to things like type 2 radio bursts, which are radio signals generated by the shock, and they're important for accelerating particles.
Solar energetic particles.
Yes, the shocks are very efficient particle accelerators.
You also mentioned ICMEs can run into each other.
They can, yeah. It's sometimes called CME cannibalism. If a fast CME is launched after a slower one in roughly the same direction,
It catches up.
it can overtake and merge with the slower one. These interactions can create more complex structures and potentially lead to more intense geomagnetic storms if the combined structure hits Earth.
Has that happened?
It's thought that some of the biggest historical storms, maybe even the Carrington event, might have involved multiple interacting CMEs.
Wow. And does the ICME's own magnetic field orientation matter when it reaches Earth?
Hugely important, absolutely crucial in fact, especially the direction of the magnetic field within the ICME structure, the flux rope. It governs how efficiently the ICME can connect with Earth's own magnetic field via magnetic reconnection. If the ICME's field has a strong component pointing south, opposite to Earth's northward field at the day side.
They connect more easily.
Much more easily, yes. That allows energy and plasma to flow efficiently into our magnetosphere, driving a strong geomagnetic storm. A southward magnetic field is the key ingredient we look for.
Okay, so an ICME arrives. It's traveled for days. What are the signs in the solar wind data, say, from a satellite parked upstream from Earth?
Often a well-structured ICME shows up as what we call a magnetic cloud.
Magnetic cloud. What defines that?
Several things. Usually the magnetic field strength is much higher than the normal solar wind. The direction of the field rotates smoothly over many hours. And often the proton temperature inside the cloud is unusually low.
So it's like this distinct, organized magnetic bubble passing by.
That's a good description, yeah.
Yeah?
A coherent structure within the more variable solar wind.
What's the typical sequence if a fast one is heading our way?
You'd usually see the shock wave arrive first. That's a sharp jump in speed, density, temperature, magnetic field.
The boom.
Right. Then behind the shock, there's a turbulent region called the sheath. It's compressed, heated solar wind material mixed with some ICME material.
And then the magnetic cloud.
Then hopefully you see the magnetic cloud itself with that smooth field rotation and strong field.
Are there other, maybe more subtle signs?
Yes. Sometimes you see bidirectional superthermal electrons. These are energetic electrons streaming along the magnetic field lines in both directions, suggesting they're trapped on closed loops within the cloud.
Interesting.
And also sometimes unusual compositions, like different ratios of ions, iron, helium, oxygen, that reflect the conditions back in the sun's corona where the CME originated, rather than the normal solar wind.
How long does this whole structure, the magnetic cloud part, usually take to pass Earth?
Typically, the magnetic cloud itself might take about a day to sweep past a point, like the L1 Lagrange point, which is where many of our upstream monitors sit.
So the main impact window is around 24 hours.
Roughly, yes. Of course, it depends on the size and speed.
Yeah.
A typical cloud might be, say, 0.15 AU across, traveling at 450 kilometers. That gives you about a day's passage time.
Okay, let's zoom out again. The solar cycle. How does CME frequency change over that 11-year cycle?
It changes dramatically, very closely tied to the cycle.
So fewer at solar minimum.
Way fewer. Maybe only one every 5 days, so about 0.2 per day on average when the sun is quietest.
And at solar maximum.
It ramps right up. You can get an average of maybe 3.5 CMEs per day near the peak of activity.
That's a huge difference.
It is. And interestingly, the peak number of CMEs often happens a bit after the peak in sunspot numbers, maybe 6 to 12 months later.
So the highest risk might actually be just after the sunspot maximum.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, so lots of CMEs happen, but obviously only a few hit Earth. When one does hit, what are the main impacts we worry about?
The arrival, especially the shock wave and the magnetic cloud, disrupts Earth's magnetosphere. That causes a geomagnetic storm.
And that storm then causes problems.
Yes, a whole cascade of effects. Radio communications, particularly high-frequency radio that relies on the ionosphere, can be severely disrupted or blacked out.
Okay, what else?
A big concern is induced currents. The changing magnetic fields during a storm can induce electrical currents in long conductors on the ground,
Like
pipelines, railway lines, and especially electrical power grids. These induced currents can overload transformers and cause widespread power outages.
that Quebec blackout in 1989, that was caused by this.
That's the classic example, yes. A major geomagnetic storm induced currents that tripped circuit breakers across the Hydro-Quebec power grid. Millions lost power for hours.
Wow. And what about those energetic particles accelerated by the shock?
Right, the solar energetic particles, or SX. If the CME drives a strong shock near the sun, it can accelerate these particles to really high energies.
And they reach Earth quickly.
Some can arrive in well under an hour. When they hit the atmosphere, especially over the poles, they ionize it heavily, leading to polar cap absorption, or PCA. This absorbs high-frequency radio waves, disrupting communications for flights on polar routes, for instance.
So threats to ground systems and aviation, and satellites too.
Definitely. Geomagnetic storms can drastically change the radiation environment in space around Earth. The radiation belts can become much more intense.
It was bad for satellites.
Very bad. It can damage electronics, degrade solar panels, cause phantom commands. It increases the risk for satellite operations significantly.
I often hear about halo CMEs and space weather forecasts. What are they?
Yes. A halo CME is one that, in coronagraph images, looks like it's expanding outwards in all directions, forming a halo or ring around the occulting disk.
Because it's coming right at us, or away from us.
Exactly. That perspective effect suggests it's aimed generally along the Sun-Earth line. A partial halo is one that's still wide, maybe over 120 degrees, but not a full circle.
So a halo CME is a warning sign.
It's a strong indicator that a CME might be Earth-directed, especially if it originates on the front side of the Sun. But it's not a guarantee it will hit or cause a big storm.
Why not?
Well, it might miss slightly, or it might arrive but be slow, or crucially, its internal magnetic field might not have that strong southward component needed for a major connection with our magnetosphere.
So it's a clue, but not the whole story.
Precisely.
Given all this, what's the risk of another really big one, another Carrington event?
People are trying to estimate that. It's tricky. Using historical data and stats, one study from 2019 estimated the probability for the next decade.
Yes.
It was somewhere between about 0.5% and maybe 1.9%, something like that.
So low probability in any given decade, but definitely not zero.
Exactly. It's a low-frequency, high-impact type of hazard. We need to be prepared.
Just incredible stuff. When did we first even realize these things existed?
Well, indirectly, people have seen the effects the aurora for millennia. And there were other hints, like those geomagnetic disturbances, weird radio signals from the sun.
But actually seeing them leave the sun.
That came much, much later. Even the Carrington event in 1859, while they saw the flare in the huge geomagnetic storm, they didn't connect it to a mass ejection. The technology wasn't there.
So when was the first direct observation?
December 14th, 1971, by a coronagraph on the OSO-7 satellite. That was the first time we really saw one.
1971. That's surprisingly recent in astronomy terms.
It really is. People had seen coronal transients during eclipses before, which we now know were basically CMEs, but continuous observation from space was the game changer.
What were the key missions?
OSO-7 was the first, then Skylab had a great coronagraph in the 70s. Later, missions like SMM P78-1. Then in the modern era, SOHO, launched in 95, was revolutionary. And the Stereo mission.
Stereo. Those were the twin spacecraft.
Yeah, launched in 2006. They gave us the first 3D views, seeing CMEs from different angles simultaneously. Hugely important for understanding their structure and how they travel.
Aside from Carrington and Quebec, are there other famous CMEs?
Oh, sure. There was a huge one in July 2012. Super powerful, Carrington class maybe.
Did it hit us?
No, luckily. It missed Earth's orbit.
Yeah.
A very near miss, though. A reminder of what's possible.
Phew. Any others?
Well, there was one in October 2014 that was interesting because it was observed by spacecraft all over the solar system, near Earth, Mars, Saturn. Even the Curiosity rover on Mars saw effects. A really well-observed event.
It really drives home how these things affect the whole solar system. Does this happen on other stars too? Stellar CMEs?
We think so, yes. It's harder to see, obviously, but there's growing evidence.
How do you detect something like that so far away?
Mostly through spectroscopy. Looking for distortions in the star's light, especially in hydrogen lines, that suggest a large mass of gas moving rapidly away from the star, a Doppler shift signature.
Mostly on smaller stars. Red dwarfs.
Yes, most detections so far have been on M dwarfs, red dwarfs. Maybe because they're very magnetically active, or maybe just because they're common and we have lots of data.
Are they as frequent as on our sun?
It's hard to say for sure yet. The current observations suggest maybe less frequent. But there are lots of observational biases. We might be missing many of them due to viewing angle, or maybe the signatures aren't always clear.
Still an active area of research then.
Very much so. And it's important for understanding exoplanet habitability too. If planets orbiting these stars are constantly getting blasted by CMEs.
Could strip away their atmosphere.
Exactly. It's a big factor in whether life could survive there.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. A real journey from the sun's core, almost, out to Earth and even other stars.
It really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? from the fundamental plasma physics to the very real impacts on our technology and lives.
And despite how much we know, thanks to missions like SOHO and Stereo, there are still big mysteries, like exactly how they ignite.
Precisely. The initiation mechanism, the details of their propagation through the messy solar wind, lots still to figure out.
It just highlights how connected everything is in the solar system. What happens on the sun, 93 million miles off, really matters here.
Absolutely. Space weather is real, and understanding CMEs is a huge part of that.
Definitely gives you something profound to think about next time you see pictures of the aurora, or even just look up at the sun. Carefully, of course. Thanks so much for this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a truly dynamic subject.